Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Doug Smith, and this is the 7th video in this series we are calling the Opioid Monologue. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground, and we have moved quickly, and that was by design, that was the intent. I wanted to get us quickly to a point where we can move past this addiction nonsense. That's what it is. It's addiction nonsense. We are now at a point where the scientific evidence is overwhelming, and that's the key. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. Overwhelming. This means we can move on, and that's exactly what we need to do. We need to move on and put this addiction nonsense behind us. There are millions of people who need our help. They are dying, and they will continue to die. We need to immediately stabilize millions of people on 16 milligrams a day of buprenorphine. This dosage is known as the blockade level and with an 80% opioid receptor saturation. What we are attempting to block, some of which is the slide towards opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency. See, we have two epidemics. The first is the induced genetic defect caused by exposure to the opioids and results in autonomic conflict. The second epidemic, brought on perhaps by the lack of treatment or treatment with counseling, is a deadly and hard to treat condition called opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency. Listen to me. You do not want widespread adrenal insufficiency. This is a diagnosis, a hard to treat condition that will kill you. You can see the estimates run as high as 8 to 29% of the afflicted. The world has never seen mass adrenal insufficiency. This has no precedence. And don't tell me the counseling we dumped on these people was harmless. Don't tell me these abstinence-based approaches and facilities are harmless. Let's be honest. It's the addiction crowd, the ASAM people, the SAMHSA people. It's these people who have ignored science and medicine and who believed in an impossibility. It's these people who have so mistreated the first epidemic that thanks to their incompetence, we are now facing a second deadly epidemic called opioid-induced adrenal insufficiency. And this is amazing. This is just amazing. And this is why we need to get to this, the pivotal point. This is where we need to be, okay? We need to pivot away from the old and pivot towards the new. We need to pivot away from treating something called addiction and pivot towards treating the autonomic conflict caused by the genetic toxicity of the opioids. The faster we pivot, the more people we save. The slower we pivot, the more people will die. And what are they dying from? Well, mostly fentanyl. Why are they taking fentanyl or heroin or hydrocodone or oxycodone or whatever they can get? To temporarily escape the horror of autonomic conflict and with the loss of control of the internal organs. They are in desperate need of urgent medical attention and for truly life-saving medical treatment for a life-threatening medical condition. As a country, we need to mobilize and fast. It can be done. It's not that hard. I am laying out a plan of action that can be scaled down to a community or scaled up to the state. I'm calling it the Smith Plan, and I stand behind this plan. We have been out in the communities and on the front lines of this opioid crisis for coming up on 1,500 consecutive days, and with telemedicine. And we know what works. More importantly, we know what doesn't work. We can pivot and turn around any community or state that wants our help. Okay, we'll get into the details in the upcoming videos. For now, let's review briefly what we have covered. Okay, then in a few minutes, I want to share something amazing with you. Now, we went through this briefly at the beginning, but I want to go over this again, okay? This is a warning from 9 years ago, a warning that this might happen, a warning with clarity and accuracy. Too bad the FDA missed it. But first, a brief review, okay? We began with the quote from the experts at Johns Hopkins. Okay, and this quote basically said, counseling without buprenorphine is worthless. Counseling without buprenorphine is worthless. And we asked the question, if counseling without buprenorphine is worthless, why did we do it? Okay, and one possible answer we found here with Dr. Andrew Saxon. Okay, and he stated one obvious possibility is a financial incentive. This would mean that we are supplying an absolutely worthless treatment and for a deadly epidemic, and that the reason that we are doing this is so that a small group of people can make a tremendous amount of money off of the counseling. That's amazing. That is amazing. We then said, how did we end up recommending this worthless counseling? How did counseling become the treatment plan? And we discussed how a treatment plan is determined by the diagnosis. And when we looked deeper into the diagnosis of opioid addiction, we found that there was no scientific evidence to support the diagnosis of opioid addiction. Okay, remember here on page 25 of the ASAM document, remember the citing of the 32-year-old study while ignoring the later studies that disproved the concept that opioid addiction was through a surge of dopamine in the brain. Very dishonest, very dishonest, very dishonest to cite the older study while ignoring the newer studies that were done with better technology and that disproved the dopamine theory of addiction for the opioids. History will judge that moment. We then went on to how these same experts not only ignored the foundations of science, but went on to ignore the foundations of medicine by failing to develop an explanation for their findings. Remember this on the COWS, okay, or current opioid withdrawal scale. Now, when I looked at this COWS, I recognized not addiction, but autonomic conflict, plain as day. No doubt about it. Autonomic conflict, a true medical emergency, a loss of control over the internal organs. And autonomic conflict is impossible in a person with normal anatomy and function. Okay, and that's where we said, if you do not like what we're saying, just prove us wrong. Don't yell at us. Don't try to discredit us. Don't try to undermine us. Let's not use tone and volume. Just prove us wrong by showing us a group of people with normal anatomy and normal function who have episodic autonomic conflict. And the answer is they cannot. They can't. They cannot prove us wrong. We went on to a brief discussion of familial dysautonomia, an inherited genetic disorder of the autonomic and sensory nervous system that shared some characteristics with our people, mainly episodic autonomic crisis. Okay? And in both the inherited genetic disorder and in the induced genetic disorder, the induced genetic disorder that resulted from opioid toxicity to the DNA, we can pinpoint and with extreme precision exactly where the area in the human genome, our genes, we can see exactly the areas involved. We'll be getting deeper into that in the Smith hypothesis. The scientific evidence supporting the Smith hypothesis and the exact mechanism of action we'll go through it all in the future videos. Lots of science ahead of us. But this is where we are, and it is time to pivot. Okay, this is a call to action. This is a call to mobilize and rescue these people. They are dying. How about that for a treatment plan? We actually mobilize, rescue, and stabilize these people. And we will get into all that beginning in the next video. But I wanted to end this first section with a simply incredible scientific article. We actually looked at it a little bit in the beginning. Okay, the name of this article, it's a tough name. Okay, sometimes in science you got to get past the words. But the name of this article is this article here by Moshe. And the title is The Implications of DNA Methylation for Toxicology Towards Toxicomethylomics, the Toxicology of DNA Methylation. And the author is Moshe out of Quebec. And let me just share this quote with you. And this is from 2011. This is 9 years ago. And here is the quote. The realization that long-range damage could be caused without changing the DNA sequence has important implications on the way we assess the safety of chemicals, drugs, and food and broadens the scope of definition of toxic agents. Wow. I asked the viewers to stop this video and reread that quote a few times and let it just sink in. Without knowing he was talking about the opioid crisis, Moshe just nailed the opioid crisis. The realization that long-range damage could be caused without changing the DNA sequence. That's exactly what this methylation from the opioids has done. The methylation has caused long-range damage and without changing the sequence of the DNA, but by silencing select areas of the DNA. Obviously, something important to control the internal organs got turned off. Let me say that again. Obviously, something important to control of the internal organs got turned off. It's that simple. Okay, do not make this difficult. It's really a simple concept. Something that the body needed to maintain control of the internal organs was turned off and not made by the gene silencing, some switch or widget or flux capacitor or protein, whatever. It simply wasn't made, and due to the gene silencing and due to the methylation. We will see all of this in depth in the Smith hypothesis. Now, back to Moshe. Important implications in the way we assess the safety of drugs. Maybe drugs such as the opioids. Did anybody at the FDA read this article? Are you people even trying to do your job? Okay, and finally from Mr. Moshe, quote, broadens the scope of the definition of toxic agents. Broadens the scope of the definition of toxic agents. Brilliant. This man is brilliant. This article is amazing. By the way, he actually raises a question about the permanency of the methylation, that possibly you could have some reversal, not of the methylation, but of where the methylation occurs. There may be a ray of hope in this article. Okay, now if you want to see what a true scientific article looks and reads, try this one. Okay, it's time to end this. It's time to pivot. If you are a community leader and you want to stay with the addiction crowd, then a lot of your people, a lot of your citizens are going to die. But if you are a community leader and you want to pivot with us, let's get to work. My name is Dr. Doug Smith, and these are the Opioid Monologues.